That kind of dynamic encourages self-harm by rewarding it. You always have to be in a position that warrants sympathy if that's the foundation of your relationship. And in the event, this is important too, in the event you rise above sympathy, so for once you're just doing good, you're going to be punished for it because you're violating the boundaries of the relationship that you set previously. Thank you so much for joining. This is Austin in another entry of the Responding Kind series, which is based on the book Responding Kind. And this entry is actually going to be an interesting one. So if you've ever had a recurring pattern of being around people who seem to punish you for being happy, or if you've ever gotten the sense that being well isn't emotionally safe, then this speech may be very enlightening for you. So this one is going to be about pity seeking. Now, pity seeking in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like many things in life, it's just a tool that you can choose to use or not to use. So things like cars, guns, words for that matter, they can all be used for the betterment or the destruction of life. It's the context of application that determines whether something is good or bad. So in this speech, I'm going to be talking about the pathological usage, or to put it crudely, the bad use, which is when you do this mindlessly or unknowingly in a way that causes those effects that I talked about earlier. So it helps to define what we're going to be talking about before we get into it. And pity seeking is when you position or present yourself as someone to be concerned about or sympathetic towards. It's a social strategy that people use in hopes of triggering the goodwill response in the listener. And generally speaking, this tends to go one of two ways. And you have to listen carefully because you have to be very mindful when assessing which of these is the case. So best case scenario, you're lowering your social status so that you're more accessible and you're easier to speak to, because it's common knowledge that there's a discomfort that comes with speaking to people that you perceive or know are above you, people who are seen as an authority, or people who are intimidating. And if you're in that position of someone who is an authority or intimidating, what you do when you pity seek is you even the playing field, so to speak, by showing vulnerability. And we're going to get to vulnerability later, so just keep that in the back of your mind. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario, hold on, we have a helicopter. Okay, worst case scenario, you're literally tearing yourself down and exploiting your weaknesses in hopes of creating an opportunity for the listener to be a good Samaritan or to be a hero and help you. Now, I saw this all the time in the dance community. So you would go and you'd see a performer freaking kill a performance. I mean, the entire room is in awe. Just, you had no choice but to acknowledge how great they were. And you go over to them to give them some well-earned praise. And as soon as you start giving it to them, they'd give you the aw shucks, right? They'd look down at the floor, their shoulders are slumped forward, and they'd say something along the lines of, oh, I'm really not that good, and I messed up at this part, and I have so much to learn. There are so many people better than me, you know, giving you the aw shucks. And in their mind, they're attempting to be humble, but they're attacking themselves so aggressively, you really can't help but feel sorry for them. Now, contrast that to a situation when you'd go to Millennium or any other studio where more industry professionals train at. And they'd express a similar perspective of, you know, saying they still have so much growing they'd like to do and where they'd like to improve. But just the slight difference in their word choice, their tone, their body language, you could see clearly that this person wasn't being pathetic, they were just being a perfectionist. And so the difference between being pathetic and being critical is very slight, and it does take some social sophistication to be able to both convey and read the difference. But while the difference is slight, they're not the same thing at all. But getting back to pity seeking, we all know that there are going to be those people out there who are going to exploit your kindness for weakness. And they'll use pity seeking to get as much out of you as you're willing to give. At the same time, you have to be mindful not to label everyone who pity seeks as a user, because that's just a bit too pessimistic. Because from what I've seen, you have to keep in mind, pity seeking is a strategy for establishing a connection, meaning. There are those people out there who just don't know any other way of making friends than to bare their bones and share their suffering. Okay, I was one of them at one point. And even when I was stuck with this habit of pity seeking, it's not that I was doing it as a part of some dastardly plan. I just didn't know any other way of connecting with you or building rapport. Now, here's something interesting looking back on that maybe you can relate to if you've also dealt with this and you've been in these situations. I found that on the surface, in regards to the relationships I created with pity seeking, when that was what established things, on the surface, those friendships may have appeared to have been very loving and very supportive, but in reality, almost none of those relationships were truly empowering, right? A common scenario that would happen is maybe something would happen that would injure or wound my self-esteem, or even I would say something myself that would injure or wound my self-esteem. And then these people would say something in comfort like, oh, don't let anyone make you feel that way, or ignore anyone who makes you feel less than, right? So they're saying something to comfort me. But never mind the fact that majority of those emotional injuries were self-inflicted or even just postured. Maybe I was just posing as someone who was hurt, right? Or even in those instances where I was hurting myself, what was failed to be acknowledged is I was hurting myself, and I felt as though I had to, because in these particular relationships with these particular friends, the only time they would treat me good is if I was doing bad. And the people who have been in those shoes know how terrible that feels. The precedence of those relationships was set from the beginning, and it was something like, when I feel bad, you give me sympathy, and that feels good, and that's why we get along. Which sounds great. It sounds like it's really hitting the compassionate part of humanity. But the problem is that kind of dynamic encourages self-harm by rewarding it. You always have to be in a position that warrants sympathy if that's the foundation of your relationship. And in the event, this is important too, in the event you rise above sympathy, so for once you're just doing good, you're going to be punished for it because you're violating the boundaries of the relationship that you set previously. Listen, if this person has spent any time getting to know you, adapting to and learning your behaviors, then when you behave differently, they're essentially dealing with a stranger. And people don't like that at all, not a bit, okay? People like a certain degree of predictability and consistency. As humans, our brains have a massive capacity for pattern recognition and patterns. At times, we'll even find patterns when they're not there. We love consistency, we love patterns. And so if you set the standard that you are someone to feel sorry for, then they will consistently expect that from you, and that's a terrible position to put yourself in as far as what people should expect from you. You'd be better off giving them randomness and unpredictability, because even if you're that unpredictable friend, people will take comfort in being able to predict that you will consistently be unpredictable. So even that's a better pattern than being someone that consistently someone will have to feel sorry for. And like I said, in the event you stray out of that standard, you stray out of that pattern, you're going to be punished for it. Now, earlier we mentioned vulnerability, and I'm coming back to it now because I'm fully convinced that vulnerability is one of the keys to an authentic connection and a loving relationship. However, I don't think it's so simple, because the very meaning of vulnerability is going to be dependent on your life circumstances and your character. So by that I mean, for people who are confident in their strengths and secure in what they're good at, they're secure in being praised and being in the light, then they would be right to believe that vulnerability is expressing your weaknesses and your concerns. But for the people who have an easier time communicating their worries and their fears and their pains, and they're most comfortable when people are sympathetic towards them or looking down on them, then vulnerability would actually be standing in your strengths. It would be allowing people to see you as great as you are and not minimizing yourself for safety or for fear of criticism. That's what vulnerability would be, and it really depends on where you're at in your life. It's not so clear to me, or anyone for that matter, that vulnerability is just being weak, being meek. That's not the case. Now, I have a story that ties all of these concepts together, and as convenient as that is, this is actually a true story. This really happened. So, in 2018, when I went to the psych ward, I was very much a habitual pity seeker. So within 20 minutes of meeting me and us interacting and engaging, you would have a good idea of my insecurities and my dissatisfactions. But when I lost everything after going to the psych ward, I came home and I'd lost all my friends, me and my girlfriend had broken up, and I lost all the jobs I was working, so I had a lot of free time. And in that free time, I did a lot of deep work. I mean, that kind of production was unreal. Like, I read more in that first year coming home than I had in my entire life. I am being so genuine. And so when one of my friends reached out to reconnect, one of my old friends, she was actually taken aback when she saw me and saw what I'd become. So much so that a week after reconnecting, she actually said she no longer wanted to continue our friendship. Her exact words were, "This friendship is no longer serving her." And I'm not gonna lie, on one hand, that was really heartbreaking because, like I said, this was the first person to reach out to me after I lost everything, after I came home from the psych ward. I'd known her for years and she was really close to me, so it was actually heartbreaking to lose that friendship. On the other hand, I'm not gonna lie to you, I was stoked to know that the changes that I was trying so hard to implement were actually palpable, that someone could actually read that I was becoming and being a different person. But back to the point. The point is that to her, the fact that I wasn't expressing my worries and my concerns anymore seemed fake, because because that's not what she was used to. That's not the pattern that I'd set in the past. That's not who I was. But I'd gotten to a point in my life where I had more self-respect and more self-esteem than ever before, because I was doing genuinely hard things. And I couldn't talk about how insecure I was, because I'd confronted a lot of challenges and limits that I was genuinely afraid of, and I overcame them. And I couldn't talk to her about how badly I felt anymore, because for the first time in my life, it felt pretty good to be Austin J. Bailey. And to her, that seemed fake. That didn't seem authentic. That didn't seem real. Now, thankfully, we were able to salvage our friendship, and we text every now and again, we FaceTime. She actually had a son, and I'm really stoked for her and her new family. But it seems like we'll be friends for the rest of our lives. But that transition of getting our relationship from where it was to where it is now, that could have easily have just collapsed. We didn't have to continue being friends, because our friendship was evolving. It was moving to a place where neither of us was dependent on one person being pathetic and another person being sympathetic. Now we were getting to a place where we could both be doing good, and we could celebrate it. We could bask in our strengths without worrying about one person punishing the other person. And so I'll finish with this, because you do have to be mindful about pity seeking and being in that meager position. It's not inherently bad, but it is something you have to be mindful about. And if you can't deploy it without feeling like it's weakening your very character, then it should be avoided altogether. And that's what the entry was about. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, drop a comment, let me know what you think. I love the engagement with you guys. And it's always a pleasure. I enjoy sharing these insights with you. So I hope to see you at the next one. Cheers.